Why smart, caring people get pulled into narcissistic relationships. Have you ever looked back on a relationship and asked yourself a painful question? How did I not see it? How did someone who seemed so charming, attentive, magnetic, and understanding eventually become controlling, manipulative, emotionally draining, or even cruel? And maybe the harder question underneath that one is this: what does it say about me that I got involved in the first place? For many people who have lived through a narcissistic relationship, that question carries enormous shame. They replay conversations, they revisit red flags, they criticize themselves for staying too long, trusting too deeply, or giving too much. But here's what's important to understand right from the beginning. Most people do not knowingly walk into emotionally unhealthy relationships. They walk into what appears to be connection. They walk into what feels like chemistry. They walk into attention, warmth, excitement, validation, and hope. And often, by the time they realize what they're truly dealing with, they're already emotionally invested. That's why this conversation matters, because understanding how narcissistic dynamics begin can help you stop blaming yourself and start recognizing patterns with clarity instead of confusion. And if you can recognize the patterns, you can begin protecting your emotional well-being, your boundaries, your identity, and your future relationships. So let's explore why emotionally healthy, intelligent, compassionate people can still get drawn into narcissistic relationships, and what you can do differently moving forward. You didn't know what you didn't know. One of the biggest reasons people become entangled with narcissists is surprisingly simple. At the beginning, they often don't recognize the behavior for what it is. When most people hear the word narcissist, they imagine someone obviously arrogant, loud, self-absorbed, or boastful. But many narcissistic individuals don't present that way initially. In fact, many come across as attentive, confident, engaging, emotionally expressive, socially skilled, generous, charismatic, or deeply interested in you. Early on, their behavior can feel incredibly appealing. And here's the problem. Healthy people typically do not assume manipulation. If you're a sincere person, you probably approach relationships with sincerity. If you value honesty, you naturally expect honesty from others. If you're caring and empathetic, you tend to assume other people operate from similar motivations. That's why manipulation can be so disorienting for emotionally healthy individuals. Your mind is not automatically scanning for exploitation. The narcissistic person's mind often is. While you're trying to connect, they may already be assessing how emotionally available you are, how forgiving you are, how easily influenced you are, how much validation you crave, how willing you are to prioritize others over yourself, and how much control they may eventually gain. But because their tactics often unfold gradually, you don't immediately recognize the danger. At first, it just feels like attraction, or chemistry, or emotional intensity, or finally feeling understood. Only later do the contradictions begin appearing. Only later do the manipulation tactics emerge. Guilt, defensiveness, blame shifting, emotional inconsistency, gaslighting, superiority, criticism, control, emotional withdrawal, or chronic conflict. And by then, emotional attachment has often already formed. That's why hindsight can feel brutal. You look backward with knowledge you didn't have at the time. Sometimes the narcissist was already part of your life. Another reality many people overlook is that narcissistic relationships don't always begin with a conscious choice. Sometimes the narcissistic person was already embedded in your environment. Maybe it was a parent, a sibling, an extended family member, a coworker, a longtime friend, or someone in your social circle. In many cases, people grow up around emotionally unhealthy behavior without realizing it's unhealthy. If criticism, control, emotional unpredictability, guilt, or manipulation were normalized in your childhood, you may unconsciously adapt to those dynamics. You learn survival patterns like people-pleasing, avoiding conflict, over-explaining yourself, minimizing your own needs, becoming hyper-attuned to others' emotions, or trying to earn approval. And then later in adulthood, narcissistic personalities can feel strangely familiar, not healthy, not peaceful, not safe, just familiar. And familiarity can sometimes masquerade as connection. You may find yourself gravitating toward dynamics your nervous system already understands, even if those dynamics are emotionally harmful. That doesn't mean you wanted dysfunction. It simply means unresolved relational patterns often repeat themselves until they are consciously examined. Narcissists often make extremely strong first impressions. One defining trait many narcissistic individuals possess is the ability to create powerful emotional impressions. They know how to draw people in. Some do it through charm, some through confidence, some through flattery, some through humor, some through intensity, some through vulnerability, some through attention. But the effect is often the same. You feel emotionally seen very quickly. And for many people, that level of attention can feel intoxicating. The narcissistic individual may compliment you constantly, mirror your interests, agree with your values, appear fascinated by your thoughts, shower you with attention, make you feel uniquely special, or move the emotional connection forward very rapidly. You begin thinking, this person really understands me. But often, what feels like deep emotional intimacy is actually accelerated emotional attachment. Healthy relationships usually develop gradually. Trust develops over time. Character reveals itself through consistency. But narcissistic dynamics often move fast because speed creates emotional dependency before discernment fully develops. And once emotional attachment deepens, objectivity becomes harder, especially if physical intimacy enters the relationship early. That's one reason emotional pacing matters so much. When relationships move too quickly, you may become emotionally invested before you've had enough time to evaluate character, emotional maturity, accountability, empathy, consistency, or integrity. Charm is not character. Attention is not emotional health. Intensity is not intimacy. And chemistry alone is never enough to sustain a healthy relationship. Caring people are often vulnerable to exploitation. One painful reality is that narcissistic individuals are often drawn toward highly compassionate people. Why? Because caring people naturally give patience, understanding, emotional labor, second chances, support, empathy, forgiveness, and reassurance. These are beautiful qualities in healthy relationships. But in unhealthy relationships, those same qualities can be exploited. A narcissistic person may quickly recognize, this person is nurturing. This person is forgiving. This person wants harmony. This person wants to help. And instead of reciprocating those qualities, they may simply consume them. You may start by believing, if I love them enough, things will improve. If I support them enough, they'll feel secure. If I explain myself better, they'll understand. If I stay patient, things will stabilize. But narcissistic dynamics often create a one-sided emotional system where your empathy increases, your emotional labor increases, your self-doubt increases, and your exhaustion increases. Meanwhile, the narcissistic person may feel increasingly entitled to your emotional energy. The tragedy is that many compassionate people assume their kindness will eventually inspire mutual kindness. But emotionally manipulative individuals often interpret excessive accommodation not as love, but as access. Emotional hunger can make you more vulnerable. Timing also matters. Many people become vulnerable to narcissistic relationships during emotionally difficult seasons of life. Maybe you were lonely, grieving, rejected, insecure, emotionally exhausted, disconnected, recovering from heartbreak, struggling with self-worth, or deeply craving support and affirmation. And then someone appears who seems to offer exactly what you've been missing. They validate you. They pursue you intensely. They reassure you. They make you feel chosen, important, wanted, special. And emotionally, that can feel incredibly powerful. The narcissistic individual may instinctively sense emotional vulnerability, not necessarily in a calculated movie villain kind of way, but many are highly sensitive to emotional openings. They often know how to identify people seeking validation, people craving closeness, people longing for approval, or people afraid of abandonment. And because they often desire admiration, control, or emotional supply, emotionally hungry individuals can become especially attractive to them. That's why healing your emotional wounds matters so deeply. Unhealed loneliness can distort discernment. When someone is starving emotionally, even unhealthy attention can feel nourishing. Narcissists often associate themselves with excitement and pleasure. In the early stages, narcissistic personalities can make life feel exciting. They may appear adventurous, spontaneous, confident, socially dynamic, ambitious, or highly engaging. Being around them may initially feel energizing. They create experiences, memories, intensity, momentum, and that excitement can become emotionally addictive. You may feel constantly stimulated, emotionally activated, pursued, entertained, admired, or swept into a fast-moving connection. But over time, the relationship often shifts. What once felt exciting starts becoming emotionally unstable. The highs become mixed with criticism, withdrawal, inconsistency, emotional punishment, jealousy, manipulation, or power struggles. And many people unknowingly become trapped chasing the good version of the narcissistic person they met in the beginning. They keep hoping the warmth, affection, and charm will permanently return. But often, the early idealization phase was never sustainable. It was part of the attachment cycle. Narcissistic traits sometimes intensify over time. Another important truth is that narcissistic tendencies are not always fully visible at the beginning. Some individuals initially appear relatively functional or manageable. But over time, certain life circumstances may intensify narcissistic behavior. Success can sometimes amplify entitlement. Power can amplify control. Recognition can amplify superiority. Likewise, disappointment, failure, insecurity, aging, rejection, or loss can also intensify narcissistic defenses. As life pressures increase, emotionally immature coping patterns often become more pronounced. The person who once seemed merely self-centered may become increasingly controlling, angry, defensive, critical, rigid, or emotionally domineering. And many partners become confused because they keep comparing the current person to who they were in the beginning. They keep hoping they'll go back to how they used to be. But sometimes the early version was incomplete, performative, or unsustainable. So how do you protect yourself moving forward? Awareness alone is not enough. You also need adjustments. Healthy boundaries, healthy pacing, healthy discernment, healthy self-trust. So let's talk about what those adjustments can look like. Slow down emotional momentum. One of the most protective things you can do is slow relationships down. Narcissistic personalities often push for rapid emotional intimacy, immediate loyalty, quick commitment, fast trust, or accelerated attachment. Healthy people pace themselves. They observe, they evaluate, they notice patterns. They allow consistency to reveal character. When someone pressures you emotionally, remember, urgency is not proof of love. A healthy relationship can survive patience. Pay attention to how someone responds when you set boundaries, take your time, say no, request space, or disagree. Their reaction will tell you far more than their charm. Watch for black and white thinking. Narcissistic individuals often communicate in extremes. Everything becomes all good or all bad, loyalty or betrayal, success or failure, superiority or inferiority. They may say things like, "You always," "You never," "If you loved me, you would," "You're either with me or against me." This rigid thinking creates emotional pressure. Healthy relationships allow complexity, nuance, differences, discussion, individuality. You do not need to surrender your identity to maintain connection. Stay anchored in your core values. One major danger in narcissistic relationships is gradual identity erosion. Over time, you may begin abandoning your intuition, your priorities, your boundaries, your friendships, your goals, your emotional needs, or your personal convictions. That's why it's critical to stay grounded in your values. Ask yourself, what matters most to me? What kind of relationships do I actually want? What behaviors violate my sense of peace? What treatment am I no longer willing to normalize? If someone repeatedly pressures you to betray your integrity for the sake of keeping the relationship intact, that relationship is already unhealthy. Listen when trusted people express concern. One of the most common regrets people express after narcissistic relationships is this: people tried to warn me. Friends noticed, family noticed, coworkers noticed. But emotional attachment often clouds perception. Now, this doesn't mean every outside opinion is automatically correct. But if multiple emotionally healthy people consistently express concern about someone's behavior, take that seriously. Especially if they observe manipulation, disrespect, emotional instability, controlling tendencies, dishonesty, or cruelty. Sometimes outsiders can see patterns more clearly than the person emotionally immersed in the relationship. Practice assertiveness without guilt. Perhaps the most important adjustment of all is learning assertiveness. Narcissistic individuals often rely on guilt, intimidation, pressure, or emotional manipulation to maintain control. So when you begin asserting yourself, they may react strongly. They may call you selfish, difficult, cold, dramatic, ungrateful, disloyal, or unreasonable. But healthy assertiveness is not cruelty, it is clarity. It is the ability to say, "That doesn't work for me. I disagree. I need space. I'm not comfortable with that. I will not continue this conversation if I'm being disrespected. These are my boundaries." And yes, some people will dislike your boundaries precisely because your boundaries limit their control. That does not make the boundaries wrong. Final thoughts. If you've been involved with a narcissistic person, it does not mean you are weak. It does not mean you are unintelligent. It does not mean you deserved manipulation. More often, it means you brought sincerity into a relationship where someone else brought self-interest, emotional immaturity, or control. And because you approached the relationship with good faith, you initially interpreted their behavior through a healthy lens. But now you know more, and awareness changes things. You can learn to trust your intuition, slow emotional attachment, recognize manipulation, maintain boundaries, listen to healthy feedback, and protect your identity. Most importantly, you can stop defining yourself by the fact that someone manipulated you. The goal is not becoming cold, suspicious, or emotionally shut down. The goal is becoming wiser without losing your capacity for love, empathy, kindness, and connection. Because healthy relationships absolutely do exist. But healthy relationships do not require you to abandon yourself in order to keep them.